start with the contradiction. A man who wanted to disappear walked straight into the world's brightest spotlight and never left it. On November 24, 1971, Thanksgiving Eve, he bought a one-way ticket at the Northwest Orient counter in Portland with a name that felt like a shrug: Dan Cooper. The ticket agent remembered the neat suit and the quiet voice. The flight attendants would later remember the order: bourbon and 7-Up. And the note he slid across the aisle that stewardess Florence Schaffner first thought was a phone number. She didn't want to look. He insisted. The handwriting was tidy, practical. He had a bomb, he said, in the black tie and clip-on tie clasp and those sunglasses that never reflected quite enough. America's most polite hijacker began the only perfect vanishing act this country has ever hosted. The ransom was specific: $200,000 in 20s, and the instructions were stern: 4 parachutes, rear airstair lowered after takeoff, wheels down, slow and low over the dark-stitched fields of Washington. Newspapers would later call him suave. The Bureau would call him patient. The pilots called him Sir. And somewhere between the hum of the 727's engines and the dead air of night, he did what no one else has done since. He stepped into the weather and rewrote his name with gravity. That's the official story. But the unofficial one, the one this episode will test, is messier and more human. It doesn't end with a jump. It ends with a choice. The question isn't who was D.B. Cooper. It's who had to become him to survive the fall. Before we braid suspects, we need to braid evidence. 3 artifacts that behave like magnets in a drawer of metal shards. First, the tie. Left on seat 18E like a calling card no one could decipher, the black JCPenney clip-on bore a universe in dust, rare titanium particles, trace metals from aerospace, and specialized fabrication. The kind of stuff you found on the collars of mid-century engineers who ate lunch 2 tables from jet parts. Second, the money. 9 years after the jump, an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram dug at the Columbia River's Tinnabar and turned up bundles of decayed 20s, still bound with original rubber bands. $5,800 of the ransom, half buried in sand that didn't consistently flood. It was like the river had tried to hand back a single sentence of a lost paragraph. Third, the flight path, the so-called Victor 23 corridor, shadowed by a pressure bump on the plane's instruments, a bruise on a machine that suggested when the door dropped and mass exited. Put these pieces on the table and watch how they pull at the people. A chemical fingerprint that screams factory floor. A river offering that smells staged or accidental depending on the angle. A corridor across black timber where men once jumped for practice and for war. If Cooper was a fantasy, those particles, those bills, that pressure dip didn't get the memo. They behave like facts. But facts are patient liars when we stack them into the shape of a person. So tonight, we won't marry a theory. We'll let 5 of them compete for your breath. Thread 1, the soldier who never stopped falling. Richard Floyd McCoy, Vietnam veteran, helicopter pilot, and months after Cooper, the copycat who hijacked a plane with a hand grenade and leapt out with $500,000. The similarities are a hypnotist's watch, the note, the parachutes, the calm. McCoy's friend said he wore the same kind of competence Cooper wore, square-shouldered, unfazed, more mission than man. The FBI said no, pointing to the holiday alibi and facial differences. But listen to the rhythm, not the melody. McCoy bragged to friends he could do Cooper better. then did. He landed in prison and escaped with a paper gun. A paper gun. He died in a shootout 2 years later, younger than the legend he chased. Could a man obsessed with the jump have been the man who wrote the script? If he was, he collected his own ransom by repeating it. If he wasn't, he proves the blueprint was survivable, at least for someone with the body memory of turbulence and the unblinking faith of a person who trusts nylon and night. McCoy is a mirror, convincing at a glance, wrong under prolonged stare. But mirrors teach us the room's light. He shows us a Cooper who was military in bearing, unromantic in execution, and practical enough to demand the airstair lowered like a field door. If McCoy isn't Cooper, he's the ghostwriter. Proof that what sounds insane in the living room sounds obvious to men who learn to step into wind as if it were a hallway. Thread 2. The engineer in the steel dust. The kind of man who could spend all day inside the lungs of a jet and call it Tuesday. Sheridan Peterson was a Boeing technician, a smoke jumper, a man who looked like the composite sketch had a cousin. He knew the 727's rear stairs the way a church organist knows the keys, by feel. He traveled light, argued lighter, and answered questions with questions. Those titanium particles on the tie? Perfectly at home near specialized production lines. Those sunglasses? Perfectly at home on a face that hated fluorescent light. Peterson denied it, mocked it, then wore the suspicion like a sweater he refused to take off. Skeptics point out the timeline gaps, the physical differences, the lack of any flushed ransom. Believers point to a kind of occupational motive. Who else would trust the hinge, the step, the airfoil wake swirling under a tail at 10,000 feet? Tonight, we're not canonizing suspects, we're auditioning them. Peterson doesn't give us certainty. He gives us plausibility, the way the tie dust makes a person-shaped invitation to a Boeing break room at lunch. Could Cooper have been the man who knew exactly how much wind that stair could take? Could he have been the tech who understood the butter zone between stall speed and clean air? If he wasn't Peterson, he was someone Peterson would have recognized in the mirror. Not a thief in a movie, but a colleague who chose his apocalypse with a clipboard. Thread 3. The chameleon who kept changing names until the case forgot its own. Robert Rackstraw, decorated veteran helicopter pilot, fraud artist, and walking headline, was accused, dismissed, revived, dismissed again, like a television that won't stay off. He teased journalists with winks, carried forgeries like spare cigarettes, and seemed to enjoy the serotonin the Cooper rumor gave him. He fit the puzzle by refusing to fit anything else. Did he have the skills? Absolutely. The temperament? Dangerous enough to try. The link to the tie dust? Thin. The link to the money? Ghostly. But Rackstraw teaches us a mechanical lesson. Cooper didn't need to be a saint of discretion. He needed to be allergic to panic. He had to sit in 18E with a bomb, or the theater of one, and outrun the most sophisticated manhunt in American aviation by trusting gravity more than the ground. Rackstraw's gift was audacity bordering on performance art. Cooper's gift was discipline so quiet it looks like luck. Put Rackstraw on our braid, and he stains the thread a little with chaos. He reminds us Cooper might have been a man who loved the idea of Cooper more than oxygen. If Rackstraw wasn't the hijacker, and the Bureau says he wasn't, he was still part of the case's metabolism. The way this story attracts men who want to be the man who stepped into night and didn't come back wrong. Audacity is a suspect too. Keep it on the board. We're not done with it yet. Thread 4. Kenneth Christensen, the quiet purser who poured coffee for strangers 30,000 feet above the Midwest long before 1971. A former paratrooper, mechanic, and Northwest Orient employee, he moved through airports the way fish move through dark water, comfortable, invisible. After his death, his brother opened a strongbox and found gold coins, stacks of old bills, and a clipping about Cooper that looked handled too often. A friend remembered him joking once, "They never did catch that fellow, did they?" Then smiling like he'd just won a small argument with history. Christensen matched the height, the build, the practiced calm, even the accent. He knew the company's aircraft by smell. The 727's back stairs weren't mystery, they were workplace architecture. But the cash bundles didn't match the serials, and no one could prove the money came from a storm-soaked ransom. His defenders say coincidence. His believers say confession by omission. Christensen represents the most dangerous theory of all, the one that feels too tidy. If Cooper was him, then the mystery isn't romantic, it's clerical. A man using insider knowledge and a moment of post-Vietnam fatigue to buy a small retirement and a big silence. Yet tidy stories rarely echo for 50 years. They end. Cooper didn't. Which means if Christensen fit the suit, something larger wore the legend. Thread 5. William Smith, the forgotten engineer. A naval veteran, an electrical expert, a man who spent the 1940s crawling through bombers with measuring tape and clipboard. He lived near the very plant where the 727 prototypes were built. He'd been laid off, short on pension, and bitter at an airline industry that aged men out like batteries. In 1971, he was in his mid-40s, exactly the range witnesses described. His daughter later said he knew too much about airplanes to ride them. That's a sentence worth underlining. Smith could have designed the descent profile Cooper demanded. He would have known the altitude where a parachute opens without ripping. He also had access to surplus flight suits and a mind tuned to systems, fuel, hydraulics, schedules. The FBI never cleared him because they never truly looked. The files stop at rumor, resume at silence. What makes Smith fascinating isn't evidence, but motive geometry. A man watching his trade replaced by computers, deciding to make one last problem no machine could solve. Every era gets the outlaw it deserves. Post-industrial America got one who used engineering as rebellion. If Cooper was Smith, he wasn't chasing money. He was demonstrating a theorem that even a system built for control could still lose track of a single human vector. Maybe that's why the tie glittered with titanium dust, a souvenir of the shop floor that invented flight and forgot its craftsmen. By 1972, the investigation was the largest in Bureau history. 6,000 suspects, 200 interrogations, one invisible man. Agents combed logging roads, rented helicopters, mapped air currents, and listened to farmers who swore they heard a body hit the trees. None of it mattered. No parachute, no skeleton, no bloodied briefcase. The Pacific Northwest devoured him like weather devours scent. But the Bureau kept the hunt alive by collecting theories the way entomologists pin butterflies, fragile, bright, and incapable of flight. Some believed he died on impact. Others swore he limped out of the woods and built a cabin. A few claimed he walked into Vancouver, wearing the same calm expression. Every year that followed, the file thickened like scar tissue. Detectives retired. Evidence boxes warped from damp. And yet the story refused to decay. When the ransom money surfaced in 1980 on the Columbia shore, half buried but intact enough to verify, the Bureau realized something unnerving. The bills had been deposited upstream but surfaced downstream, in a layer of soil geologists swore was too new. The river didn't unearth them, it rearranged them. That's when the case stopped being criminal and started being geological, a mystery measured in silt instead of fingerprints. It was as if the earth itself wanted to participate in the legend. The more the years passed, the more the case mutated into folklore. Skydivers traced his route for sport. Bar bands renamed themselves the Jet Men. Every November, bars in Oregon filled with men in clip-on ties and bourbon breath, toasting the last gentleman thief. But there's an undercurrent people forget, the fear that the story rewrote. The FAA changed flight protocols, outlawed rear stair operation in midair. The hijack wave that followed, 70 attempts in 2 years, turned the skies from playground to panic zone. Each imitator chipped away at Cooper's charm until the myth was the only part that could still fly. Psychologists studying the case talk about identification disorder, men absorbing a legend until it replaces their own narrative. The country that once believed in astronauts now believed in escape artists. D.B. Cooper became our national daydream, a man who looked at modernity's seatbelt sign and unbuckled. But myths have metabolism. They eat their creators. Every time another suspect died, the legend grew lighter, shedding flesh, turning into an archetype with Ray-Ban eyes and a storm for a pulse. Eventually, even law enforcement stopped chasing a person. They were chasing momentum, a leap frozen between departure and gravity. The mystery had achieved terminal velocity. Half a century later, the FBI closed the file, calling it administratively exhausted. But closing a file is not closing a story. Independent researchers bought fragments of the ransom bills on eBay, sent them to labs, pulled new chemical signatures the Bureau missed, marine bacteria, microabrasion from fine sand, traces of fertilizer. One scientist compared them to samples from a farm along the Washougal River and whispered something that didn't fit on paper. These notes have moved underwater, as if the money had been carried, not dropped. That detail reopened an old wound. Maybe Cooper never touched the river. Maybe someone else seeded the find to keep belief alive. The FBI won't comment, but physics will. Wind at 10,000 feet that night blew northeast. The flight path crosses terrain pocked with logging roads and caves. If you wanted to vanish, you couldn't design better geography. The woods don't just hide, they metabolize. Everything organic becomes part of the canopy story. Maybe Cooper learned that lesson mid-fall. Maybe he hit the trees, lived long enough to watch the searchlight sweep past, and realized something terrible. Survival meant surrendering the legend. To live would be to end it. To vanish would be to preserve it. Either way, the sound he heard last wasn't wind or engines. It was applause from the dark. 50 years after the jump, the Pacific Northwest still hums with his afterimage. Pilots who fly the Portland-Seattle corridor call it the quiet lane. Instruments flicker once at 10,000 feet, just long enough to be noticed, never long enough to prove. Air traffic logs record the anomaly as transient interference. Locals have another word for it, Cooper weather, a static pressure that rolls in on cold nights and tastes like copper. One captain told investigators that the first time it happened, the cabin lights dimmed and the radio caught a voice between frequencies saying, "Don't follow." Engineers blame overlapping signals from forestry towers. Folklore blames unfinished business. There's a pattern, though. Every time the phenomenon returns, it's within 2 days of Thanksgiving. Same route, same altitude, same brief surge in barometric noise that looks on instruments like someone stepping out of a plane. Whatever fell that night didn't stop falling, it's just been looping, replaying its descent through time. Some nights, the cloud cover hangs low enough to look like memory itself, trying to touch ground. And if you listen through the static, you might hear it again. A man's calm voice asking for bourbon and soda, and the wind answering, "Copy that." Not all hauntings wear white sheets. Some wear FBI letterhead. In 2011, a retired agent mailed a local paper a photocopy of an old note allegedly found in an evidence box mislabeled MISC. It contained 2 sentences in perfect typewriter font. "I'm still above you." Flight 305 never landed. The Bureau called it a prank, but the carbon smudge-matched ribbons discontinued in 1972. When analysts scanned the page under UV, faint indentations formed a map, tiny topographic lines matching the Columbia River Basin. Someone, decades later, was still corresponding with an altitude. Amateur sleuths tore the forests apart chasing coordinates, unearthing nothing but bottle caps and deer bones. Yet the note changed the case's tone. No longer a whodunit, but a "where is it now?" Online forums lit up with new data, new obsessions. A podcaster claimed she tracked a repeating radio frequency near Ariel, Washington, the same frequency Northwest Orient once used for in-flight navigation. For 3 nights straight, she recorded a pulsing click exactly every 21 seconds. Then, on the 4th night, it stopped. In the final recording, right before silence, a voice whispered a single word: "Forward." It could have been a glitch, or it could have been gravity clearing its throat. Some stories fold back into themselves through coincidence, others through inheritance. In 2019, a woman cleaning her late father's cabin near Tutla River found an old canvas duffel stamped with NWO Air 727. Inside were flight manuals, a pilot's headset, and a weather-stained boarding pass for Flight 305, dated 1 day after the hijacking. The paper had yellowed, but the signature at the bottom was fresh ink, still oily, still wet to the touch. Forensic labs couldn't replicate it. The ink refused to dry. The woman said her father had been obsessed with the case, convinced that Cooper was some kind of test. He used to stand on the porch each Thanksgiving Eve, facing the sky with a radio pressed to his ear. "He's not gone," he'd say. "He's just between." Between what? No one ever asked. When investigators returned weeks later to re-examine the duffel, it had vanished. The only thing left was a single $20 bill pinned to the wall with a nail. Serial number partially visible, L63168-544. One of the missing ransom notes, or an imitation good enough to trick belief itself. Either way, the cabin door creaked in the wind, opening and closing, like something rehearsing departure. Folklore metastasizes. In Ariel, the town nearest Cooper's suspected drop zone, teenagers dare each other to spend a night under the old transmission tower. They call it the staircase. The local sheriff calls it trespassing. Still, every November, headlights gather like modern campfires, and someone always swears they see a man standing on the highest rung, necktie fluttering against the storm. Phones catch nothing but distortion, vertical streaks of gray that look, when paused, like parachute cords. Anthropologists studying the phenomenon call it a feedback haunting, the landscape repeating what people expect to see. But one year, a kid named Avery went missing during the dare. Search teams found his jacket snagged 40 feet up, zipper torn clean off as if lifted. Written on the lining in ballpoint pen were 3 words: low and slow. The same phrase Cooper used when instructing pilots how to fly the getaway route. Avery's friends said they heard wind screaming through the metal lattice that night. But it wasn't random. It was measured, deliberate, almost syllabic. Whatever sings over that tower each Thanksgiving, it keeps perfect rhythm with the Bureau's original flight log. Every legend eventually recruits believers who'd rather join it than solve it. The Cooper case built its own congregation: retired airmen, engineers, ex-spouses, cryptologists. A priest who claimed to have heard confession from a man who fell upward. They meet once a year in a Seattle bar called the Tail Section, comparing clues like relics. They bring fragments, tie clips, decayed bills, shreds of parachute fabric bleached by riverlight. They speak of him the way saints speak of miracles, not if it happened, but what it meant. One woman, a former Northwest stewardess, says she dreams of the hijacking every November, but it never ends. The plane circles forever above a black ocean, passengers asleep, oxygen masks swaying like pendulums. When she wakes, she always smells jet fuel and wet pine. Trauma, maybe, or a memory that refuses to land. Before closing each meeting, they raise a glass and repeat the toast that has become ritual. To the man who jumped and taught us gravity isn't mandatory. The bartender says the lights always flicker on that line. This year, they flickered twice. The first real break in years came from a graduate student in atmospheric physics. He was building a simulation of microclimate turbulence using archived flight data and stumbled across a spike in barometric pressure at 8:13 p.m. on November 24, 1971. The same minute Cooper vanished. The anomaly wasn't random, it oscillated, a rhythmic rise and fall, repeating every 7 seconds like the beat of wings. When he overlaid it on modern radar recordings from that same air corridor, the pattern repeated every Thanksgiving Eve, faint, precise, steady. Whatever that pressure bump was, it hadn't dissipated. It was recurring, like a loop in the weather itself. The student joked in his paper that it was the sky replaying a mistake. The Bureau didn't laugh. They reclassified his findings, sealed them under aviation atmospheric phenomena, and quietly interviewed the kid about his data sources. He left academia 6 months later, citing noise in the field. But his laptop logs leaked online in 2018. Every November, for the past 50 years, the air pressure over that section of the Cascades dips exactly once, exactly at 8:13 p.m. Science calls it anomaly. Folklore calls it remembrance. But if air itself remembers, then maybe gravity does too. And maybe it still wants its missing passenger back. 2 winters later, hikers near Tena Bar found something the Bureau swore didn't exist anymore. A length of ripstop nylon tangled in alder roots, faded green, stitched with serial markings used by the U.S. Air Force in the late 1960s. Along one seam, a rusted pin. The recovery team bagged it, logged it, and promptly lost it in transit to Quantico. Weeks later, a package arrived at an Oregon radio station containing what looked like the same material, folded neatly, no return address. Inside was a single Polaroid of a tree line seen from above, grainy, angled, blurred by motion. On the back, in block letters, same view, different jump. Forensic analysts concluded the photograph was taken from an altitude of roughly 10,000 feet, using a camera model discontinued in 1972. How it appeared in the mail 50 years later, undegraded and bright, no one could answer. Some viewers said they could see a shadowed figure near the bottom edge of the photo, legs apart, arms spread, falling. Others saw nothing but clouds. The Bureau marked it probable hoax. But hoaxes don't hum. And if you put your ear against the envelope, even now, there's a faint sound pressed into the paper, like wind pushing through canvas. Then came the mimic. Thanksgiving 2021, exactly 50 years to the night. An unmarked Cessna disappeared from radar over the Columbia River Gorge. The pilot, a 42-year-old named Elias Crane, filed no flight plan, carried no passengers, and transmitted a single message before losing contact. The doors opened. Search teams found no wreckage, no beacon, no signal. Only a single seatbelt washed ashore days later. In Crane's house, investigators discovered an entire wall covered in maps, flight paths, and equations written in marker, repeating one phrase, flaps down, lights low. A friend said Crane had been obsessed with the Cooper case since childhood. His last email read simply, "I just want to see what he saw." The official report calls it pilot suicide, but the weather that night was clear, the plane well maintained, and the final blip on radar didn't descend. It held steady, stationary, for exactly 12 seconds before vanishing. 12 seconds. The same interval between the final two radio transmissions from Flight 305 in 1971. Maybe that's coincidence. Maybe it's inheritance. Either way, the sky isn't done accepting volunteers. For every disappearance, there's an echo in the ground. 2 weeks after Crane vanished, residents along the Columbia reported hearing metallic thuds beneath the soil, like distant construction. Seismographs registered micro tremors localized to 1/2 mile radius, same coordinates where the Tinnabar money was found. The Bureau deployed sensors, expecting machinery. What they recorded instead was frequency, 7 hertz, subaudible, repeating exactly 21 times before stopping. The pattern matched archived cockpit voice data from Flight 305, the sound produced when the aft stair drops mid-flight. Seismic instruments shouldn't capture mid-air events. Yet the vibration registered as coming from below. When investigators revisited the site, they found nothing disturbed, not even footprints. The tremor had come and gone like breath. One geologist off record said, "It's like the ground remembered something heavy that never hit it." Memory can do that, hold the outline of an impact that never arrived. Maybe that's what the Northwest is doing, replaying a fall that never completed, echoing the weight of a man who, by every known law of physics, should have been found by now. By then, the case had become contagion. Everyone wanted their own piece of the jump, the hum, the wind, the mystery. Podcasts turned the story into scripture. Filmmakers turned it into confession. The FBI refused interviews, but former agents started speaking in metaphors. One said, "He didn't disappear, he exited the measurable." Another called the file our first haunting. That word matters. Haunting means presence without body, narrative without conclusion. Cooper wasn't gone. He was distributed across memory, across landscape, across radio static. And the more people chased him, the more the signal split. Pilots still report a blip shadowing their planes over the Cascades, holding altitude, no transponder, no call sign. Sometimes, just before it fades, their instruments spike to 8,131 feet, the last recorded altitude of Flight 305 before the door opened. Coincidence, again? Or the sky counting years like heartbeats? Every generation gets its own Cooper. Every Thanksgiving, someone looks up, sees a shape in the clouds, and swears it's a man stepping forward into nothing. The Bureau calls it pareidolia. But maybe it's continuity. Maybe he never fell. Maybe we did. Some researchers say every unsolved mystery eventually mutates into religion. The D.B. Cooper file proves it. Online forums have become digital chapels. Usernames invoking coordinates, avatars wearing dark sunglasses. They trade relics like communion wafers, maps, transcripts, snippets of police audio slowed to half speed. One forum, Flight 305 Archive, hides a peculiar subfolder only visible at midnight UTC. Inside are looping sound files of a low wind, annotated with timestamps. The notes read, "Breathe here." When investigators traced the IP host, it led to a server farm in Tacoma, running on an abandoned frequency band once leased by Northwest Orient. Nobody pays the bill, yet the servers never shut down. The hum recorded in the files is measurable, but not traceable to any environmental source. Acousticians call it a phantom tone. Listeners call it the stair door opening again. The unsettling part isn't the sound, it's the silence that follows. An acoustic void shaped exactly like the absence of a man. If you play the file backwards, the tone resolves into Morse code. 3 letters, DBC. The translation isn't exact, but the timing is perfect. Maybe it's interference. Maybe it's proof that when humans run out of answers, the story starts telling itself. A Smithsonian archivist once said that the Cooper case has escaped its box. He meant it literally. Artifacts go missing, the clip-on tie, the cigarette butts, even the parachute mock-up, objects cataloged, photographed, stored, then found days later on the wrong shelf, sometimes upside down. Cameras catch faint motion blur when the vault is empty. Temperature sensors dip 2 degrees at 8:13 p.m. every Thanksgiving Eve, though the building's HVAC is automated. Staff call it the airstairs hour. The archivist tried an experiment, placed a barometric logger beside the evidence crate. At exactly 8:13, pressure rose as though someone were standing on the box. He joked that the case wanted to leave. That night, the security feed caught the evidence tag fluttering as if moved by exhaust. The next morning, the tie was gone. In its place, a single boarding stub dated November 25, 1971, seat 18E, return flight. The archivist resigned, claiming auditory hallucinations. A man breathing above me. The Bureau sealed the room. But every year, interns still find small scuffs on the floor, spaced evenly, heel-toe, as though someone had been pacing, waiting for takeoff. When myth outlives data, physics becomes folklore. A group of graduate researchers at Oregon State attempted to triangulate every Cooper-related event. Sightings, tremors, radio bursts, found artifacts on a temporal map. The pattern wasn't linear. It curved orbit-like, looping around the original jump coordinates. Their conclusion was unnerving. Each anomaly occurred almost exactly 1 orbital cycle apart, 50 years to the minute. Something, somewhere, was repeating itself. They called it the 813 resonance. The model looked less like an investigation and more like an ecosystem feeding on observation. The more people searched, the more data points appeared, as if attention itself was fuel. One physicist likened it to quantum superposition, the mystery existing because it's observed. Stop looking and it collapses. Keep looking and it multiplies. The Cooper enigma might not be a person or a plane. It could be a feedback loop of human curiosity, eternally mid-fall, sustained by the collective need for closure. If that's true, then every article, every forum, every whispered theory is another parachute string tugged by belief. And maybe, somewhere between frequencies, the man we invented is listening, grateful for the gravity we keep lending him. Folklorists draw parallels between Cooper and older American myths, the vanishing pioneers, the lost trainmen, the miners who walked into thunderclouds. Stories where disappearance equals freedom. But there's a darker inheritance. Every myth demands a witness. In Mill Creek, Texarkana, Roswell, each place birthed a legend when someone heard what they couldn't explain. Cooper's witnesses heard wind and turned it into a person. Now, half a century later, the witnesses are gone, but the wind remains, and it keeps the rhythm. It's easy to say he jumped for greed. Harder to admit he might have jumped for quiet. The world was loud in 1971. Vietnam, Watergate, hijackings every other week. Maybe the most radical act was leaving mid-sentence. The FBI still insists he died in the fall. Yet no bones ever surfaced, and rivers don't hold secrets for 5 decades without help. Perhaps Cooper didn't survive as flesh, but as pattern. A gesture embedded in geography, replayed until someone recognizes it. The question isn't who was D.B. Cooper, it's who keeps replaying him. Every mystery reaches the point where it starts describing us instead. Cooper's leap wasn't just from an airplane, it was from certainty. The man in the trench coat and tie became America's mirror, polite, precise, desperate to escape the system he built. The hijacking lasted 45 minutes. The fall has lasted 50 years. Maybe he did land on some ridge, broken but breathing, watching the searchlights crawl past and realizing that anonymity was the only real freedom left. Or maybe he never touched ground at all. Maybe the sky kept him as collateral, an unsolved equation balancing out our need for mystery. In the end, the D.B. Cooper story isn't about theft or death, it's about persistence. How one man stepped out of history and the hole he left became a doorway. Listen on Thanksgiving night when the air feels too still and the static on your radio thickens into pulse. That's not interference. That's continuity. The sky doesn't forget. It just loops. And somewhere at 8:13 p.m., a man in a dark suit checks his watch, smiles once, and steps forward again. The Pacific Northwest is full of ghosts that don't realize they've been promoted to legend. The rain makes it easy to believe in returns. Everything here comes back eventually. Moss on the runways, fog on the river, the echo of a voice that once ordered a bourbon and soda mid-flight. Even now, locals near Ariel swear that every Thanksgiving week, the clouds over the Columbia hang lower, heavy with something unseen. Fishermen say their radios buzz for exactly 13 seconds, then clear. Pilots check their instruments and watch altimeters flutter just once, just enough to suggest an unseen descent. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's the sky remembering itself. But listen long enough, and you begin to understand why people still search. The case isn't unsolved. It's unfinished. The difference is devotion. 50 years later, the world has changed, but the air still hums the same note, and somewhere between frequencies, a man still falls forever, graceful, unpunished, and unnamed. Gravity has never been that patient with anyone else. One reporter once called the Cooper case America's campfire. He wasn't wrong. Every generation gathers around it, warms their hands, and tells the story again. They change the details, polish the ending, but the silhouette stays the same. A figure stepping into the storm, vanishing on his own terms. There's comfort in that shape, the myth of control, of escape, of a clean exit. But there's also a warning. If a man can disappear completely, maybe anyone can. That's the part the Bureau never writes down. The hijacking wasn't just a crime, it was an audition. The audience never left the theater. We just kept waiting for the curtain to fall. Every retelling, every theory, every blurred photo keeps the spotlight on the empty stage. Maybe that's what Cooper wanted, to build a mystery strong enough to survive him, to prove that legacy doesn't require body, only story. And in that sense, he succeeded. The man's gone. The myth keeps earning interest. They say the last time anyone officially mentioned the case at FBI headquarters was in 2016, when the file was formally closed. But in the Portland field office, there's still one desk drawer labeled 305A. Inside, a paperclip, a matchbook from the Portland International Airport bar, and a single strip of parachute nylon folded like a bookmark. A note sits on top in fresh blue ink. Hold for review. Nobody claims to have written it. New recruits whisper that some nights when the building goes quiet, the typewriters clack once, just once, like an echo from a floor above. The janitor says he's seen shoe prints on desks, always the same. Size 10, narrow, wingtip. He wipes them away. They come back. It's not proof, but proof was never the point. Some mysteries earn their permanence by refusing closure. And maybe the Bureau understood that too late. When you chase a man who steps out of gravity, you end up learning how to hover. Maybe Cooper didn't disappear into the night. Maybe the night disappeared into him. The older locals have stopped calling it an investigation. They call it the reminder. They still hear the low drone over the trees, still find fragments of nylon caught on branches, still feel the weight change in the air each November. It's easy to forget that the sky is archives too. Weather, static, pressure, memory. What fell in 1971 might have split between them all, scattering a man into phenomena. A little static here, a shadow there, a cold front shaped like a question mark. Not haunting exactly, more like persistence. Some say the real mystery isn't how he vanished, but why we keep calling him back. Maybe Cooper wasn't a man escaping the world, but the world escaping itself for a moment. The rest of us have just been falling ever since. If you drive along the Columbia at night, keep your radio tuned low. Sometimes, between songs, the static breathes. Sometimes, it sounds like the wind stepping out of a plane. Pilots still glance at their altimeters. Fishermen still pause mid-cast, and every so often, someone swears they hear a calm, unhurried voice saying, "I'm still above you." It's probably nothing. Electrical interference, old stories, human pattern seeking. But when the wind shifts just right and the world goes quiet enough to notice, you'll understand why the legend never landed. Because silence remembers better than witnesses. Because stories fall slower than bodies. And because somewhere, high above the Cascades at 8:13 p.m., the sky opens just wide enough for a man in a dark suit to step forward again, grinning into the void as if he knows how this ends. Maybe he never fell. Maybe we did.